Ethan, a 12-year-old boy, lives a miserable life in a suburban landfill. Orphaned by his parents after a traffic accident, he has nowhere to turn to. Day after day, Ethan rummaged through huge piles of garbage, looking for discarded items to resell to bottle tick collectors at cheap prices. His small but nimble hands sorted beer cans, plastics, and paperboard, while his bright but always melancholy eyes showed maturity far beyond his real age. Ethan's only roof was a makeshift tent made of old corrugated iron sheets, tucked away in a corner of a wasteland near the dump. His life is a series of days full of deprivation, but in each of his actions still exudes a resilient energy and kindness hidden deep in his soul. In the heavy rain that afternoon, the suburban landfill became even more gloomy. Between the sound of falling rain and the cold howling wind, Ethan, a thin 12-year-old boy, was rummaging through the huge piles of garbage when he suddenly heard a strange sound, a faint, fragile cry that seemed to be about to go out. He stopped, his small ears puffing up, his eyes flashing with curiosity mixed with worry. The cry seemed to cry for help, making Ethan unable to ignore. He quietly approached a torn paper box, lying indifferently among the scattered pieces of garbage. When he looked inside, his heart seemed to tighten. A tiny newborn girl, her body trembling, her lips purple, her eyes closed as if fighting the cruel cold. Ethan panicked. In his heart, for the first time, fear and responsibility were intensely intertwined. What is this, he wondered, his trembling hands pulling the old raincoat, wrapping the girl tightly in his arms. Her skin was cold, making Ethan feel the fragility of this little creature. Without further hesitation, he hurried to his makeshift tent, a cramped and dilapidated refuge, but the safest place he could think of. Arriving at the tent, Ethan placed the girl on a torn mat, hurriedly trying to keep her warm with the only blanket she had. But the delicate blanket could not dispel the bone-chilling cold. "Don't cry anymore, you'll be fine," Ethan whispered, his voice hoarse with worry. Although he didn't know what to do next, he was determined not to leave the baby. He ran to the house of Mrs. Mary, a woman who sells water nearby, to borrow some formula and a feeding bottle. When he returned, the scene of an orphaned poor boy, sitting and feeding every drop of milk to the girl in the dim light, made people's hearts ache. Throughout the night, Ethan stayed awake to watch over the baby. The few drops of milk were not enough to quench his hunger, and the baby's cries kept sounding like scratching his heart. But Ethan didn't leave, his little trembling hands caressing the baby's cold face. His eyes filled with determination. From the moment he held the baby in his arms, Ethan understood that his life had changed. The landfill is no longer just a place to make a living, but now a place where a miracle happens. A poor boy finds new meaning in protecting a small creature, despite all the hardships. The next morning, as the faint sun crept through the tattered roof of the tent, Ethan awoke from a sleepless night. The little girl was lying in his lap, her breathing was more regular, but her body was still weak. Taking a closer look at the child, Ethan noticed a glittering object around his tiny wrist, a finely carved silver bracelet. On the ring was engraved a small inscription that he had to strain his eyes to read. Emma, parental love. Ethan felt his heart tighten. He looked at the girl, who now had a name, Emma. "Emma," he whispered, sounding like a promise. The bracelet not only bears the baby's name but also serves as a piece of the puzzle of the mysterious life of this creature. Who are the baby's parents? Why do they abandon their babies in a scary place like a garbage dump? Questions rushed through Ethan's mind, but there were no answers. He thought for a long time, and his hand gently grabbed the ring. Somehow, the bracelet made him feel that he wasn't completely abandoned. Perhaps her parents are still searching, or perhaps they have encountered something uncertain. Ethan didn't know, but he was determined to keep the bracelet as a clue, hoping that it would one day lead Emma back to her real family. However, there was also a vague fear in his heart. If he returned Emma to his parents, would she be abandoned again? He couldn't bear that thought. From the moment he held the baby in his arms, Ethan considered himself Emma's protector, even though he was just a poor boy living on a garbage dump. The mysterious bracelet becomes what unites Ethan and Emma, as a reminder that, despite the grim fate, this little girl deserves love and care. For Ethan, the bracelet is not only a souvenir but also a source of strength, urging him to seek a better future for both of them. Not far away, in a luxurious but cold house, Mr. and Mrs. Bennet sat quietly at the long dining table. Empty chairs surround her, as if reminiscent of the absence of Emma, the little daughter they love more than anything. Mrs. Bennet's face was emaciated, her eyes filled with endless sadness. Every moment that passed since Emma's disappearance was a knife slash into her heart. "Why did this happen to our family?" she whispered, her voice choking. Mr. Bennet, the man who had been strong and decisive, could now only bow his head, his hands clenched as if to prevent the pain from surging. He did everything, from hiring detectives, putting up notices everywhere, to begging for help from the police. But all efforts fell silent. In the room, the silver bracelet, the first birthday gift they gave Emma, was still on the table, where Mrs. Bennet placed it every day as a silent prayer. "That bracelet will protect her," she said to herself, though her heart was constantly racing with bad thoughts. Mr. Bennet, who had always comforted his wife that they would find Emma again, could not hide his growing despair. Every night, Mrs. Bennet would sit by the window, her distant eyes looking out over the street in front of the house. In her heart was a fragile hope that one day Emma would appear in the doorway, with a clear smile and small hands outstretched to call out "Mommy." But the reality is colder than that. The Bennet family is now a shadow of themselves, burdened by pain and guilt that cannot be relieved. Little did they know that the precious bracelet they had given their daughter was lying on Emma's little wrist, in a place no one expected. And that, in the midst of hardships, a boy named Ethan became the only protector of the little girl they were looking for day and night. One chilly morning, Ethan carried Emma into the small infirmary on the edge of town. The boy was tired. His eyes could not hide his anxiety as he looked at Emma, who had a high fever and was in a daze in his arms. Ethan's old coat wasn't enough to keep them warm, but he was only thinking about finding a way to save her. Inside the infirmary, Nurse Margaret, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, rushed to see the two children. "What happened to this girl?" she asked, her voice both worried and gentle. Ethan, a little hesitant, replied softly, "She has a fever. It's been many days. I don't know what to do." The short but helpless sentence made Nurse Margaret sad. She quickly took Emma into the clinic, put her on the bed, and began to check. Ethan stood by him, his hands clenched, his eyes following Margaret's every gesture as if clinging to a glimmer of hope. "Are you her brother?" Margaret asked, but Ethan just shook his head, pursed lips, and said nothing. As Emma's fever gradually subsided thanks to her devoted care, Margaret turned to Ethan. "Where are the boy, you and your sister? Where are your parents?" she asked, her voice gentle but her eyes searching. Ethan lowered his head and replied softly, "I don't have parents. Emma doesn't. I'm just trying to protect her." Those simple words made Mrs. Margaret falter. Her heart tightened with the pain that these two children had experienced. Margaret could not have imagined that this meeting would completely change their lives. Somewhere between love and responsibility, she decided that she had to do something. And no one knew that this coincidence was the first step that led Ethan and Emma to the truth about her identity, as well as a future that they never dared to dream of. That day, Ethan stood silently at the bedside, his eyes watching Emma, who had gradually regained consciousness from the dangerous fever. Margaret explained that Emma would be fine, but for Ethan, the anxiety had not gone away. Even though she was being well cared for, his mind was always watching her every move, fearing that one day Emma would leave him. When the Bennets arrived at the infirmary, Ethan felt a change in the air. They do not come with strange eyes, but with sincere and gracious feelings. Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Grace, when they saw Emma, could not contain their emotions, and Mrs. Grace, with trembling hands, embraced Emma in her arms as if she had recovered the lost treasure. "Our daughter, bow knock," Grace choked up. Ethan stood still, his eyes were red, and his chest seemed to be weighed down. He couldn't fully express how he felt right now, as if a part of his heart was broken. Everything seemed to spin in his head. He had protected Emma, taken care of her all these days, but now she would have to go back to her real family, where there was no place for him. As Grace gently bent down and rubbed Ethan's head, she said in a gentle voice, "Thank you very much. Without him, we don't know what would happen to our daughter. I did what no one else could." Ethan just stood still, not daring to say anything. The feeling of pride and pain made him unable to speak. Before Mrs. Grace and Mr. Bennet took Emma away, they promised not to forget what Ethan had done for their family. But Ethan just nodded, tears falling quietly. He didn't need anything from them. He just hoped that Emma would live happily, even if he wasn't with him anymore. The sense of loss grew in his heart as Grace held Emma in her arms, and they both left the infirmary, leaving Ethan standing quietly, watching their shadows fade into the crowd. Returning to his small hut, Ethan felt the emptiness clearly. He knew that, even though he might get help, his life would never be the same as before. Emma, the little girl he had treated as his sister, was no longer around. He would still remember his days with her, but most of all, he felt an invisible happiness, for at least she had found her true family. Despite trying to get back to the familiar rhythm of life, Ethan couldn't forget Emma. Every day, he sat in silence, looking at the lucky bracelet Emma had worn, the only thing left as an indelible memory. His heart was still intact, and even though Emma was no longer around, he still hoped that she would have a happy life. He knew that he had done the right thing, but the nostalgia and emptiness in his heart never subsided. One day, while Ethan was on his way to work, a luxury car stopped in front of his tent. His heart pounded when he saw Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Grace get out of the car. They had been looking for him, even though days had passed since Emma had been brought back. Mrs. Grace walked closer, her eyes full of appreciation and love. "We can't leave him alone. You deserve a better life," she said in a soft but determined voice. Ethan was surprised and somewhat confused. He couldn't believe that Bennet's family had come to him, after all that had happened. Mr. Bennet continued, "We want to help you. She saved our daughter, and we can't forget that. We want him to live with his family, have a real home." Ethan was silent. His mind was confused. He had been living independently for so many years, and now a new opportunity was opening up in front of him. But he didn't know what to do. "I don't know if I can fit into a family like you," Ethan whispered. He felt he would always be an outsider, a street kid, unable to fit in with the full and perfect life that the Bennet family had. Mrs. Grace looked at him kindly and patted him. "We will overcome all difficulties with you. We want you to know that our family is your family." The warm words from Mrs. Grace seemed to ease Ethan's insecurity, and he gradually felt the sincerity of the Bennet family. Finally, with some hesitation, Ethan agreed to come and live with them, accepting the help they had offered. Living in the Bennet family's mansion, Ethan gradually gets used to his new life. Everything was different. No more dumps, no longer long cold nights. But he felt lost in a world that was so clean and complete. Everyone treated him very well, but the memories of his old life about Emma were always in his mind. He understood that, no matter how things changed, his heart would always remember what had passed, his love for Emma, and the recompense that the Bennet family had given him. Every time he saw Emma smile, Ethan felt happy and peaceful. He knew that, in this life, it was not always possible to stand on his own, but there were people who were willing to help and repay the love. Bennet's family had given him a chance to live a new life, and he would never forget those kindnesses. One afternoon, when Ethan was helping Mrs. Grace tend the beautiful garden in front of the mansion, an unexpected call turned everything upside down. Mr. Bennet received a phone call, and his face immediately became tense. After hanging up, he called Ethan over. "Ethan, there's an important thing I have to tell you. Emma's abduction is not as simple as we think." Ethan was surprised, and his heart was filled with chaotic emotions. "Emma's kidnapping. But it's not. Has she been saved?" he asked, feeling anxious like a dark cloud covering his mind. Mr. Bennet nodded. then looked into the distance as if trying to find an answer. Yes, Emma has been saved, but there is one thing we haven't told you yet. Emma's kidnapping is no coincidence. We received a threatening message from an anonymous person, someone I can't specify right now. They planned it in advance, and it wasn't a coincidence. Ethan listened silently, his heart beating faster. He used to think that the kidnapping was just a bad accident, but now things seem much more complicated. But why Emma? Why did they choose her? He couldn't understand. Grace walked over, took Ethan's hand and said softly, "We don't want you to get caught up in these secrets, but now we need to face the truth. Emma was not only our daughter, but also part of a larger plan that we didn't know about. The kidnapper is not just targeting her for money, but for deeper reasons, secrets that we have tried to hide." Grace's words made Ethan feel stunned. He couldn't imagine what the Bennett family was facing. "So what should we do?" he asked, his voice lowered. Mr. Bennett looked into his eyes, determination clear in his eyes. "We have to find out who is behind this kidnapping. They have a connection to our family, and we can't let them continue to threaten Emma's life anymore. We will not let them harm my daughter again." Ethan nodded, a sense of mission rising in his heart. He is no longer a lonely boy, but is now an important part of the Bennett family's story. Together, they will uncover the secrets behind the kidnapping and protect Emma from the dangers that lurk. After hearing the painful words from the Bennett family, Ethan felt a new strength rise up in him. Not only does he want to help his family, but he also desires to find out the truth about the secrets behind Emma's kidnapping. More importantly, he wanted to regain what he had lost: his real family. The journey began when Mr. Bennett handed Ethan a set of documents that he had recovered from secret investigations. "We know you can help us, Ethan. I have gone through many difficulties and have the courage to face the truth," he said, his eyes full of hope. He took the document, his hands trembling a little with tension. Even though he knew that this would be an arduous journey, Ethan still felt an invisible force pushing him to continue. The Bennett family began to act immediately, gathering all possible information about the person behind the kidnapping. They hire private detectives, looking for clues from people involved in the family's past. Those days passed in a hurry and tension. Each investigation made Ethan feel further and further away from the reality he had always believed in. The photographs, the old diaries, the scribbled pieces of paper he found only added to the sense of ambiguity, like a door that opened to a secret world he had never understood. One night, while reading through documents in the Bennett family's library, Ethan suddenly stopped in front of an old photo. In it, a man with a familiar face stood next to Mrs. Grace, smiling happily. But what shocked Ethan was that the man was his father, someone he thought was long gone. This photo contains too many questions, and it is also the first sign that leads Ethan to something he never expected. Ethan did not hesitate, immediately sharing his findings with Mr. Bennett. I think I have found a clue. The man in the photo is his father. Does he have anything to do with the Bennett family?" he asked, his eyes full of wonder and bewilderment. Mr. Bennett looked at the photo with sad eyes. "We need to get to the end of this road, Ethan. There are family secrets that we have to deal with, and there are also facts that you need to know." He patted him on the shoulder, as if he wanted to infuse him with more strength. The journey of finding family, searching for answers, takes Ethan and the Bennett family to unexpected places. Unexpected encounters, tense episodes, and endless challenges make this trip an uphill battle. But the most important thing in this journey is not just the discovery of the truth, but the stronger bond between Ethan and the Bennett family, as they face hidden enemies, painful secrets together, and ultimately, find what matters most: family.